All right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome to our visitors as well. So for those of you joining us for the first time or for the visitors, my name is Tavi Steinhardt. I'm a recent PhD grad in anthropology and a lecturer in our anthropology department, and also sort of the host MC for this Brilliance of Berkeley lecture series. So our speaker for this week is Dr. Doris Tsao. Dr. Tsao is a professor of neurobiology in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology and an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Her research is focused on understanding the neural mechanisms that underlie vision. So how do we take light information to the retina and translate it into a meaningful understanding of the world around us? She received a bachelor's degree in biology and mathematics from Caltech and a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard prior to joining the Berkeley faculty. And since then, she's won a number of prestigious awards, including the Eppendorf Science International Prize from the American Journal of Science, as well as the MacArthur Grant. In her talk today, Dr. Tsao discusses the primate visual system and what it takes for a bundle of neurons to take in information about the world and translate it into a meaningful understanding. So, Dr. Tsao.
Great. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today, and particularly today when we're standing up for science here at Cal. So the central question I'm interested in is, how does the brain create our conscious perception of reality? How can electrical activity in a sheet of microscopic neurons generate, for example, the conscious percept of a rose? And this question has two parts. First, how does the brain represent things in the outside world? And this is a question that philosophers have thought about for millennia, and I believe there's a whole branch of philosophy called epistemology that deals with how we know things. But I think this is a very exciting and concrete scientific question. How does neural activity in the brain represent objects in the world? And I'll share with you how we're pursuing this question. But beyond this basic question of how the brain represents objects in the outside world, which I would argue robots also do, there's the question of how does the brain generate our conscious experience? So for example, the experience of a precise shade of red of the rose. Why do we have conscious experience at all? How can electrical signaling between neurons, which is a completely understandable, prosaic physical event, generate this categorically different phenomenon of a subjective experience? Why aren't we all robots implementing some kind of optimization functions that get us to propagate our genes efficiently without feeling anything inside at all? So I think this question, how does the brain generate conscious experience, is the deepest mystery in all of science. And some people think it's not even amenable to scientific inquiry, but I believe we can tackle it, and I want to share with you how we're going about doing this. So overall, what I want you to get out of today's lecture is an appreciation for how these two questions that strike at the heart of our subjective experience of the world are incredible scientific mysteries. And we can study them using the same tools of observation and logic that we use to figure out how the objective physical world works. So I want to start by telling you about how I got interested in the question of how the brain builds a representation of the outside world. So when I was a kid, I wasn't really interested in science at all. I wasn't obsessed about Star Trek or dinosaurs or anything like that. In fact, I played with Barbie dolls. But one day when I was 10 or 11, I woke up one morning and I wondered, this sort of question popped in my head, is space infinite or not? And this question really bothered me, because if space were just a giant room surrounded by a wall, then wouldn't that wall also occupy space? But on the other hand, if infinity really existed, that seemed terrifying and unlike anything I had ever thought about up to that point. So I really that was the first time I had this experience of having an actual question about the outside world. And then some years later in high school, I came across Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And I managed to read the first 50 pages, where Kant discusses this very question of whether space is infinite or not. And he concluded that the reason we can only conceive of space as being infinite is because space and also time is what he called a pure form of intuition. It's like glasses through which we see everything in the world, like ineluctably. And this was an amazing idea to me, that space, which seems like something so real and outside, is actually something that's created by our brain. And I suddenly realized that the answer to this question, that had bothered me back when I was 10 years old about whether space is infinite or not, actually wasn't out there, but it was in here. So then a few years later in college, I took a class on neuroscience, and I encountered the work of Hubel and Wiesel. So David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel were two neuroscientists who wanted to understand how vision works. And in the 1960s, they did these famous experiments where they inserted electrodes into primary visual cortex of the cat. And so here you can see a picture of their experimental setup. And so an electrode is simply a very thin wire that's insulated everywhere except at the very tip. So when it gets close to a neuron, it can pick up the electrical activity of that neuron, and then you can amplify that signal and analyze it. And Hubel and Wiesel discovered something absolutely astonishing in primary visual cortex. They found that every single neuron would respond to a visual stimulus in a specific part of space, but unlike the neurons in your retina that respond to anything in a specific part of space, these neurons in primary visual cortex were extremely selective. And each neuron would only respond to an edge. And moreover, the edge had to be at a specific orientation. So here you can see an example of an orientation selective neuron from primary visual cortex. And so here are the different stimuli on the left that Hubel and Wiesel showed to the cat while they're recording the responses of the single neuron with this electrode. And these thin vertical bars are, I don't know if there's a pointer here. Okay, yeah, so these thin vertical bars here, these are the electrical signals fired by this single neuron, okay? And so you can see that this neuron fired especially strongly when the stimulus was a vertical bar. So reading about this work was a lightning bolt for me, because it was obvious that Hubel and Wiesel had just scratched the surface of how the brain represents the world. So what happens next after local edge orientation detection? Could we do similar experiments to figure out the entire sequence of transformations that the brain uses to represent the visual world? Could we even understand how the brain builds a representation of space itself? So I was hooked. So in my talk today, first I want to introduce to you the experimental arena in which we're going to tackle this question of how the brain represents the world, the face patch system. And then I'm going to tell you about how we figured out the neural code that cells in this face patch system use to represent facial identity. And you can see this as one specific example of how neuroscientists go about this challenge of understanding how the brain represents the world. And finally, I'm going to dive into this question of how the brain represents conscious perception. So let's get started. So in my lab, we study mechanisms for visual perception in macaque monkeys whose brains are remarkably similar to ours. And in particular, the macaque brain contains a network of regions called face patches, which have turned out to be an amazing gift for visual neuroscientists, as I'll explain in a second. So here is a side view of the macaque brain. And I just told you about how cells in primary visual cortex, also known as V1, which lives in the very back of the brain, are selective for local edge orientation. So after V1, visual information proceeds through a series of additional areas that process things like texture and local figure-ground relationships and so on, until it reaches a large brain region called inferotemporal or IT cortex. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for high-level object recognition. So if you have a stroke in this part of the brain, you can become unable to recognize specific classes of objects like faces. So this area clearly plays a very important role in object recognition. And so when I was a grad student, I was scanning monkeys with red-green goggles and showing them stereograms, because as I told you, I was obsessed with this question of how space is represented. And just as a fun side project, I decided to show the monkeys pictures of faces and other objects, because I'd read this paper by a scientist at MIT that claimed that the human brain has a specific area dedicated to processing faces. And this paper seemed really strange to me because, just based on introspection, faces didn't seem all that different from other objects. So I decided to go check this out myself and do this experiment in a monkey. And I actually found not just one, but 6 patches of highly face-selective cortex that were distributed along the entire length of the temporal lobe here. Okay, and so I originally found these patches using fMRI, which stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging, and this is a technique for measuring blood flow across the brain. So as you can imagine, this is a very coarse, indirect, low resolution signal, right? People call it the brain's plumbing, the blood. Because I had done this experiment in a monkey, we could then record from neurons in these regions using this technique of inserting electrodes that Hubel and Wiesel had used to study V1 and really study what the single neurons in these regions are doing. And what we found basically changed my whole career. So now I want to show you a movie of the first face patch that I ever recorded from. This is actually one of the first cells that I recorded from. And so you're going to hear clicks, which represent the electrical signals fired by the single neuron in a face patch. And you're also going to see a sequence of images that are going to go by very fast, and that's exactly how fast the monkey saw these images. Okay. So let's listen to this single cell from a face patch. So I hope you can hear how selectively this cell responds to faces. And what was amazing was that cell after cell was exactly like this. Like every single cell in this region responded selectively to faces. And I thought this was absolutely incredible. I remember calling up my dad at 2 a.m. to tell him about this, because it was clear that we had found a gold mine. And by studying these cells systematically, we had the potential to figure out precisely how a set of neurons is encoding this ineffable thing called facial identity. And so before we go there, you might be wondering, why are there 6 face patches? And the answer turns out to be that they're each performing a different step in face processing. And so processing generally increases in complexity, going from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. And the cell I just showed you was recorded from this middle face patch ML. And now I want to show you another movie of a cell that was recorded from the most anterior face patch AM. Okay, so I want you to listen carefully and see if you can tell what this cell is responding to. Okay, so could you tell what this cell was responding to? It really liked this one person, right, this blonde guy, and responded to his face regardless of where he was looking. So I hope you could hear how this cell was very different from the earlier face cell that I showed you. Right, the earlier cell seemed to respond to every single face, right, somewhat, whereas this cell is so selective for one face. And its response to this face invariant to head orientation. And that turned out to be a general property of cells in this most anterior face patch. They seem to code specific identities invariant to head orientation. Okay, so before I tell you about how we figure out the code for facial identity, I want to give you a visceral sense for what these face patches are doing. So I'm going to do this by lesioning all of your face patches in all of you right now. Okay, so get ready. Okay, so right now, all of you have a lesion in your face patches. Okay, and now I'm going to reverse this lesion. Okay, and the reason this works is that the cells in face patches turn out to respond much more strongly to faces that are upright than upside down. So by showing you an upside down face, I'm effectively lesioning all of your face patches. Let's see, yeah. And this illusion makes clear that what your face patch system is doing is distilling the distinctive identity of a face. So without the face patches, all faces look quite similar. And because distinct identity is in the small details, you really need the specialized machinery to extract the distinctive identity. Okay, so that's the big picture of what these face patches are doing. As another window into what the face patch system is doing, we can ask, what happens when you electrically stimulate a face area to impose some random artificial pattern of activity on the cells? And obviously, I'm not able to stimulate each of your face patches right now, but here in this experiment, Joseph Parvizzi, a neurosurgeon at Stanford, was treating this patient who had epilepsy, and he had electrodes inserted in his brain for the purpose of finding the source of the epileptic seizure. And one of the electrodes happened to be located in this person's face area, right, that was mapped with fMRI. And so they obtained permission from this very brave patient to put a small amount of electrical current through this electrode and see what he perceived. And now let me show you a movie.
1, 2, 3.
You just turned into somebody else.
Tell me
Your
about
face metamorphosed. Your nose got saggy, you went to the left. You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different. That was a trip.
Did I keep my gender?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
How did you know I'm not a female?
Because you're still wearing a suit and tie.
Oh, you could see the suit and tie?
Yeah. Only your face changed. Everything else was the same.
Right, so he says only the face changed when they stimulated this area, because this area is really specialized for representing faces. Okay, so how do cells in a face patch actually represent facial identity? So we want to understand the feature code that cells use to represent facial identity. And by feature code, I mean the dictionary between visual stimuli and responses of neurons. So if we understand this feature code, then we should be able to predict the responses of a set of neurons to any visual stimulus. And if this code is faithful, then we should even be able to go backwards and reconstruct the stimulus from the responses of the neurons. And to figure out the brain's feature code for faces, we first needed a way to parameterize faces, i.e. describe every face by a set of numbers. And we considered various computer vision models for doing this, and I'm going to tell you what we found with one of the models, called the shape appearance model. So this model describes every face by a set of 50 numbers, and the first 25 numbers describe the shape of the face. So here you can see a movie of a face that's undergoing changes in these 25 shape parameters. And you can see that they code the locations of the key landmarks, right? The outline of the face, locations of the eyes, and so on. And then the second 25 numbers describe the so-called appearance of the face. And so here's a movie of a face that's undergoing changes only in these appearance parameters. And so you can see the locations of all the features are absolutely fixed, but the texture map is changing. So the complexion and so on is changing. Okay, so that gives you a visceral sense for what these 50 parameters mean. And now that we have a way of parameterizing faces, we can generate a stimulus set to probe how the brain represents facial identity. And in our experiment, we randomly selected 2,000 faces from this 50-dimensional face space. And importantly, we showed the same 2,000 faces to every cell that we recorded so that we could systematically understand how each face is represented by a population of neurons. And as a starting point, we can plot the tuning of cells to the different shape and appearance parameters. So here you can see tuning curves of 2 example cells to the first 3 shape parameters and the first 3 appearance parameters. And cell 1 was significantly tuned to this shape parameter, and cell 2 to these 2 appearance parameters. So in each plot here, the x-axis indicates the parameter value, and the y-axis indicates the firing strength of the neuron. So notice that all 3 curves here are ramp-shaped, with a minimum at one extreme and a maximum at the opposite extreme. And this was true across the population. And this ramp-shaped tuning turns out to be incredibly convenient because it means that we can directly read out the face feature value from the neuron's response. Okay, like so. Right. If we know that this neuron has this ramp-shaped tuning to this feature, then if that's its response, we know that's the value of the feature. Right? And if we record from a lot of neurons at the same time, then we can do this for each feature. And once we know the value of all 50 features, then we can reconstruct the face. So what this means is that you could walk into a room in my lab and go look at the monkey, and I could have no idea what you look like because I'm in a different room just listening to the neurons. And just using the neural activity, I would be able to reconstruct a detailed picture of your face. So do you think that's possible? Okay, here's an actual face that we presented to the monkey. And here's the reconstruction using neural activity of just 205 face cells. And here are 3 more examples. So you can see that the reconstructed faces match the actual faces almost exactly. So people say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I like to add, or 200 neurons, plus $1 million of NIH funding. So when I first started working on face patches, people would tell me, oh yeah, face processing is a total unicorn. You're not going to learn any general principles about how the brain represents objects from studying faces. But in fact, the face patch system has turned out to provide a Rosetta Stone for understanding all object coding. So we found that a large swath of IT cortex is spatially organized as a series of maps of object space that you can discover with a deep network. And face patches represent 1 quadrant of the space, but there are 3 additional object networks representing the other quadrants. So the principles of representing faces generalize completely to all of IT cortex. Okay. And by sampling neural activity from these other networks, we can approximately reconstruct arbitrary objects from just a tiny number of neurons. So these reconstructions are admittedly far from perfect, but again, we're using just a few hundred cells, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of all the neurons in IT cortex. Okay, so I hope the story I just told you gives you a sense for how neuroscientists tackle this question of understanding how the brain represents things in the outside world. And now I want to turn to this deeper mystery. How does the brain generate conscious experience? Again, that some people think is not even amenable to scientific inquiry. So when we see a face, we don't see 50 numbers. Instead, we have this very specific experience of seeing a face. And how's that experience generated? So can any of you tell what this is? Okay, what if I tell you it's a cow? No. Okay, let me try to help you. Okay, if you still can't see it. Okay, how about now? All right. So I hope you can't help but see that there are two eyes, a nose, and so on here on the left. So all the pieces click into place in your consciousness. And to tackle the problem of how the brain creates a conscious percept, we've thought long and hard about this peculiar fact of consciousness, where we always see visual details in a way that's consistent with our high-level interpretation. And so here's another example. So if you see this as a frontal face, then you also see this piece of edge as owned by the occluder on the right. Well, if you see it as a profile face, then you see the same edge as being owned by the face on the left. And it turns out that we know that the perception of the overall orientation of the face is coded in a different brain region than the part of the brain that's coding, which side owns the local piece of edge. So again, our perception of this illusion shows that we always perceive visual details in a way that's consistent with our high-level interpretation. And we think that this fact is actually a critical clue to understanding this mystery of how conscious percepts are generated. And specifically, we think this suggests that consciousness is generated by a mechanism called analysis by synthesis. And I think this is a really profound idea. And it's actually the idea that's used in all these generative AI networks nowadays. So here's how it works. When an image comes in, it first passes through a series of hierarchically arranged processing stages in a feed-forward direction to build a parsimonious model of the input. For example, an early stage might involve local edge extraction, like in V1, and then a later stage might involve extracting these 50 shape and appearance parameters. And the end result is a rough semantic representation. But we're not done. The analysis by synthesis framework says that the visual system should then try to reconstruct the input image, given this high-level interpretation. So when we see a face in this ambiguous image, then all the features would be regenerated in the context of the high-level interpretation of a face, including all the local figure-ground relationships that are represented in an early visual area. Okay. While when we see a tree and some birds in the same image, then all the local features would be regenerated afresh in the context of the high-level interpretation of a tree and some birds. And the wild proposal is that what we consciously perceive is due entirely to neural activity during this regenerative process. Right? And so this is a crazy idea that we can identify the generation of consciousness with a specific anatomical pathway here. But if it's true, it would beautifully explain why our conscious perception is always consistent across all levels of interpretation. Do you see that? Because basically, our conscious perception is generated to be so. Right? So the claim is that conscious perception of details is actually not due to the activity that represents these details in the first pass, but rather to activity that represents the details in this feedback pass. And these details have to be consistent because all of these details are generated from our high-level interpretation. Right? Isn't that a cool idea? And incidentally, as I mentioned, this U-shaped architecture is exactly what current state-of-the-art generative AI models like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion use. And they do it because it lets them learn a hierarchical representation of the data directly from the data in this so-called unsupervised or self-supervised way. Okay. So to test this profound idea of analysis by synthesis, we're using an illusion called binocular rivalry. And so in rivalry, we show two different images to the left and right eyes. And this amazing thing happens where your conscious perception actually flips in an all or none way between the two images, like so. Okay. and the switches happen stochastically. And so the important point is that you don't see mixtures. You see either the left eye image or the right eye image. And so you can get an idea of what rivalry is like here. So if I ask you, how many windows does this house have? You'll see something slightly different than if I ask you, do you know this guy or not? Right? In rivalry, the effect is much stronger. And again, it's all or none. You see one image or the other. If you don't believe me, you should come to my lab and I'll show you. So you might wonder, how can we tell which image the monkey is seeing, right? He can't talk to us. So Janis Hesse, who was a graduate student at the time, devised this very clever strategy where he trained monkeys to follow a fixation point. And importantly, the spot was moving in different ways in the two eyes. So if the monkey is following the spot in the right eye, then we know he's seeing the house. And if he's following the spot in the left eye, then we know that he's seeing the face. And in human subjects who performed this eye movement task, while also telling us with button presses of what they were seeing, we could predict their conscious percept from their eye movements with 93% accuracy, confirming that this task works as a way of figuring out what the monkey is consciously perceiving. Okay, so what's happening across the face patch system during these switches in conscious perception? To address this, we've been recording simultaneously from different face patches using a new cutting-edge tool called the NHP NeuroPixels probe. And this is a silicon probe that has 4,000 contacts along its length. And you can select several hundred of them at any one time. And so remember, the electrode that Hubel and Wiesel were using had one contact, right? So this is a tremendous new piece of technology. And here you can see a raster plot of responses of over 1,000 simultaneously recorded neurons from two face patches to the onset of this face. And the key question we want to answer is, how is a conscious percept born in the brain? So according to analysis by synthesis, the birth should happen in a high-level area, representing our high-level semantic understanding, and then propagate backwards to early areas that are representing all the details. And this is something that we can actually experimentally test to ask whether representation of conscious percept flows from top down or bottom up. And so here's a 4-second long snippet of activity from two face patches that were recorded during binocular rivalry. And the stimulus wasn't changing at all, yet you can see these very strong changes in the neural activity that were more coordinated across the two patches. And maybe you think these switches are due to the switches in perception that I told you about, but that can't be because they're happening way too frequently. Right, so here is a distribution of the interswitch intervals, and the switches in conscious percept of the monkey were happening only once every 7 seconds. So I don't have time to go into detail about how we're analyzing this data, but in a nutshell, what we're doing is analyzing what the cells are representing at each point in time. And one hypothesis we're exploring is that representation of consciousness actually occurs in discrete slices of time, spliced together with representation of unconscious physical reality. So during rivalry, perceptually what you experience is a prolonged period of seeing a face, followed by a prolonged period of seeing, say, a house. And you almost never see a mixed stimulus. But when we analyze what the neurons are representing at each moment in time, we find that they often represent both the face and the house, right? Both the conscious stimulus and the suppressed stimulus in the same 1-second interval. And so one possibility is that representation of the conscious percept, again, is interleaved with representation of the unconscious physical stimulus. And if this is true, it would mean that the seeming continuity of consciousness is actually an illusion. And what's happening in the brain is that there's periods of representation of the conscious percept interleaved with periods of representing the physical reality. And so the idea that consciousness is actually discontinuous was discussed by the visionary philosopher Julian Jaynes in his seminal book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And instantly, Jaynes was trying to argue that consciousness accounts for so little of our cognitive activity that you could actually have a whole civilization that was not conscious. And if you're curious about how that could work, I highly recommend that you read his book. So beyond all the details, I hope you can appreciate how by recording from neurons across the brain, we can see beyond. Oh, I forgot to read this beautiful quote. Okay, so consciousness is a much smaller part of our mental life than we're conscious of, because we cannot be conscious of what we're not conscious of. How simple that is to say, how difficult to appreciate. It's like asking a flashlight in a dark room to search around for something that doesn't have any light shining on it. The flashlight, since there's a light in whatever direction it turns, would have to conclude that there's light everywhere. And so consciousness can seem to pervade all mentality when actually it does not, right? So your consciousness is this flashlight. And so what I want to say is that I hope you can appreciate how, with the tools of neuroscience, we can go beyond the flashlight of our own experience to understand the actual gears by which our conscious experience is generated. And before I close, I want to pose a puzzle for you to see how closely you've been paying attention. Okay, so earlier I told you about this idea of analysis by synthesis. And just now I told you about this idea of consciousness being represented in this interleaved way, right? Where the conscious percept is interleaved with physical reality. So the puzzle is, can you see how these two ideas could be connected? You just think about it. So we think they're actually fit together perfectly. Because again, analysis by synthesis is this idea that the brain processing goes through this loop where you're always regenerating what you're seeing from the high-level interpretation. And this interleaved consciousness idea is that half the time during rivalry, you're representing conscious percept, and the other half the time you're representing the physical stimulus. And so if it's the case that during the feed-forward pass, the brain is representing physical reality, and during the feedback passes, the brain is representing conscious percept, then you would exactly predict this interleaved representation of physical reality and conscious perception. Okay, so to summarize overall, I've tried to show you today how using the tools of neuroscience, we can figure out how the brain represents the world. And this is a journey that's just starting, right? We still understand so little of this mystery, but at least for the case of faces, I think we understand it quite well now. And also, we can even begin to understand mechanistically how the brain generates conscious perception. And so finally, I thought I'd give you a bit of life advice. So if life is like an apple tree, then I think you all are at the stage of finding the seed, right? The challenge that's worth devoting your whole life to. And I think it's absolutely critical for all of you to get that right. And so if I could give you one piece of advice from all my experience as a scientist, I would think it has something to do with how precious the sense of mystery is. So my life as a neuroscientist started with this question that struck me when I was 10 years old about whether space is infinite or not. Whenever you have that sense of mystery, I think it's something so precious, and you have to treasure it and nurture it and make it grow. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
All right, so at this point, we can take questions from the audience.
Hi, I have maybe a simple question, but I was just wondering, how do you define consciousness? Is it cut and dry, or is there any debate about how to define it?
Yeah, it's like one of those things, you either know it or not, right? It's the difference between being asleep and waking up. It's that subjective experience. And then you can ask, what is subjective experience? It's consciousness. All of these definitions are loopy. I personally think that that's no different from defining anything, right? How do you define anything? It's always in terms of these other concepts, and ultimately it's in terms of what you actually experience. in the real world, right? So I think like anything, it's basically impossible to define consciousness. You can assign it a set of words, and people who know what it means think that it makes sense.
My question is, in more context, what do you mean by space is constructed by the brain?
So we perceive space, I perceive 3 dimensions. Somehow that's due to activity of neurons in the brain. Like to really answer your question, I would have to tell you how that works, and I don't know the answer. So I think that's probably like a very unsatisfactory answer. But maybe just by analogy, I tried to show you how the perception of facial identity is constructed by the brain. And there, I think I did show you a lot of details of how that works, right? You have these neurons that are tuned to these different shape and appearance parameters. Every neuron is representing, like a subset of parameters. And so together, the neurons are encoding all of the values of these shape and appearance parameters that are needed to define the identity, right? So it's, does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
And like all questions in neuroscience, neuroscience is like this amazing field that sits at the intersection of biology, psychology, and math, right? So as neuroscientists, we sort of, to explain how neurons construct some kind of psychological phenomenon like spatial perception or facial identity, we boil the phenomenon down to like a mathematical description, right? In the case of faces, there are these 50 dimensions that capture the identity of the face. In case of spatial perception, it's the 3 dimensions. And then we study how the neurons are representing those, mathematical entities that you can actually define. But then there's like this question that lurks behind all of this of how do you, why does this neural activity construct your actual subjective experience, psychological experience of space or of facial identity? And, we're still at very, very early stages of answering that, right? Like I tried to tell you in the part of my talk about consciousness how we're getting at this question of why perception is always consistent, right? It's just so clear and consistent. I think like that's a scientific question that we can actually approach now. There's this like bigger question. People say it's a hard problem of how do you actually encode qualia, like that quality of the redness of the rose, or the quality of 3-dimensional space, or the quality of someone's facial identity. That's a question I think we have no inkling right now. But I do believe in the fullness of time, like it's solvable. Yeah.
Thank you again for speaking with us today. But if you're willing to tell us, what's like the next question in analyzing like the visual cortex in the brain that you're trying to answer?
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you a secret. So I'm super excited right now to study this region called parietal cortex, posterior parietal cortex. So I told you today about the temporal lobe. That's the part that's responsible for object recognition. But if you look at people with strokes and lesions, it turns out, I told you what happens when you have a temporal lobe lesion, you become unable to recognize objects, right? And there's another part of temporal lobe where you become unable to form new memories. But what happens in the parietal lobe is that you become completely unaware, right? So you can have like a lesion to your left parietal lobe, and you become completely unaware of whatever's happening in the right half of space. Like if you put a plate of pasta in front of a person with the left parietal lobe lesion, they will just eat the left half of the the pasta and totally ignore the right half. And so I think this is actually the part of the brain that's critically important for generating conscious perception of reality, and it's also the gateway to motor cortex. So it's the part of the brain that's representing physical reality, right? Like what is the shape of that object? Like this is really this like I think it's like I think of it as the brain's like geometric and physics engine. Okay, so that's where I'm super excited about going to next.
I wanted to ask, why does the brain think stereotypically?
Why does the brain think stereotypically? So I think by that, like, why do we have stereotypes? I think it's like efficient. The brain is always trying to code the world, trying to predict what's going to happen in the world, right? And what is a stereotype? It's basically a statistical pattern. And so the brain, that's the job of the brain, is to figure out the statistical patterns. In the case of the visual system, I told you that's processing the information through this series of stages, and what those stages are essentially doing is compressing the visual information. And I described this feedback loop that's through which it's trying to regenerate the image, right? Trying to predict the incoming input, right? So the brain is this compressive, predictive machine, and so I think stereotypes are kind of an inevitable consequence of that, right? It's just a statistical pattern that the brain picks up, and so we really have to use our conscious, intentional awareness to overcome stereotypical thinking.
Do you experiment any animals besides monkeys?
Yeah, I've gone through, I used to read all these papers about mouse neuroscience where they could do amazing things like, activate specific patterns of neurons using light, which is a technique pioneered by my colleague Hillel Desnick here. And so I got very jealous. So for a while, actually, my lab was running mouse experiments and also experiments in this other species called the tree shrew that has like really big eyes, great vision. It's also more experimentally tractable than monkeys. So we discovered that the tree shrew visual system has a very highly compressed version of the monkey visual system, where like just the area V2 is doing all these functions that monkey IT cortex is doing. But after moving to Berkeley a few years ago, I became rededicated to monkeys because the deepest source of my inspiration is to understand how I see, and I really think that the primate model is the best model for understanding that question. And I think that it's actually easier to bring the tools, develop the tools so that they can be applied to monkeys rather than, but you can never turn a mouse into a monkey.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great questions.
Why do you think, or what do you think the evolutionary adaptiveness of consciousness is, and why do you think it's unique to humans?
I don't think it's unique to humans. I think that, what is the evolutionary? It's a very interesting question. Like from one perspective, you could say that you could argue, and I used to argue this, that there is no evolutionary utility to consciousness, because if we were all so-called P-zombies, right? Philosophical zombies, like we had no conscious experience, but our behavior was exactly like we normally behave, right? Evolution would work exactly the same, right? Our genes would still get selected in the same way. And so evolution is really blind to our internal conscious experience, right? So I think that's such a profound question. Why do we have conscious experience then? I teach a class here at Berkeley called Philosophy, Film, and Neuroscience. And actually last week, the students sparked this insight in me. So we were talking about free will, right, which is slightly related. And, free will always starts with this concept of I, right? Like I came to class today. And so, which is closely related to consciousness, right? You have this model of your conscious self. And so what the students suggested was that even though free will seems like an illusion, right? Given everything we know about the brain and how it works, it's this, set of gears that are just churning onwards. Like there's no like ghost in the machine that's making like random decisions that are, divorced from the churning of those gears. Even though it seems like an illusion, the student suggested that it's evolutionarily useful because you need it for society, a social, group to function, right? Like to assign blame or praise or responsibility, you have to have this concept that you had free will to do this, right? And so I think that this concept of I is very natural. Like there's an evolutionary function to having a model of a self and a model of agency, right? That self has free will, right? But those are, again, all things that you could implement in a robot as well, right? If you had a colony of robots that needed to have like some kind of system of laws, like they could develop that without being actually conscious, right? So the deeper question is, why do we have this subjective experience? And to that, I don't believe there's an evolutionary explanation for that. I believe that's something we have to accept, the same way we have to accept that, matter exists.